Welcome back to an emergency episode of BadgerBlitz TV, your rivals.com destination for all things Wisconsin athletics. I'm Matt Perkins, joined by editor-in-chief of BadgerBlitz.com, Jon McNamara, today because, John, there was a bomb that went off at Camp Randall Stadium last night and this morning, and I'm not talking about what we saw on the field yesterday, because that's an issue unto itself. Luke Fickell is going to be the next head coach of the Wisconsin Badgers. And even though I talked about this exact scenario with Bernie and Brian Calhoun last week on my Believe podcast, I still can't believe it's happening. John, how the heck did we get here?
Shocked. I'm not going to come on here and say that I knew this was coming or thought this was coming. I'm shocked. And then, in instances like this, I'm sure you get the same thing, Matt. Your phone just starts blowing up, and it's just going and going and going. I was just kind of sitting down, and I was sending messages out to recruits because Wisconsin had a lot of kids on campus yesterday. So that's my usual Sunday is sitting down and trying to hammer out with them right around this time, and then ESPN comes out with that report. You try to start to confirm things, but Pete Thamel, I think he was the first one to come out. He's got a pretty good track record, right? So hey, let's look for the verification, make sure it's him, and then you take that and you run with it and make sure you got stuff and you're starting to line stuff up with your staff. I mean, it's wild. You going to bed last night, you're 99% sure that either Jim Leonhard is going to get hired on Sunday or Jim Leonhard is going to get hired on Monday. And then to have this bomb drop, it's pretty wild. It's amazing. I didn't see something like this happening. Maybe a best case scenario for Wisconsin and something that you maybe didn't even think was in play, throughout this coaching search.
What is insane to me is what you mentioned that was so important is the fact that you're throwing away 25 years of alumni and goodwill, because Jimmy is the golden child in a lot of ways, right? He is sort of the ultimate Wisconsin underdog story, and everyone sort of gravitates to that, right? He's been, since he stepped on campus, a legend in his own time. And, knowing the people that I do in the groups that I run in, he is revered among his peers, and that's something that you truly rarely see. And the thing to worry about for the program going forward is how disenfranchised will that alumni base feel, and how hurt will they be, and how much will that affect, the bottom line and the passion and the way that, they always talk about the Badgers being a different type of program. This is definitely a step in a new direction. And maybe that's just the way of collegiate athletics in this day and age.
Right. And that's an important side to dive into is, how do you approach former players about this? How do you approach alumni about this? If there's a face of the program from a player side, from the time that I can remember, covering this program and, just growing up inside the state and following this program, and it's Jim Leonhard. And then obviously from the other side is Barry Alvarez. And for Chris McIntosh to have two of probably the most difficult conversations in Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin history, of looking at Paul Chryst and saying, we're moving in a different direction. And then weeks later, having the same conversation with Jim Leonhard, it's amazing to me. I mean, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. Those two conversations for a new first-year athletic director to make, they're huge, huge decisions. And again, I'm not saying that's the right move or the wrong move to make. Those are just two huge moves that Chris McIntosh has made during his first couple months as the athletic director at Wisconsin.
And those are really big swings that are going to be career-defining things for Mac. They are absolutely, if he misses on this, or if Fickell bolts in 2 years to become the Ohio State head coach, that is, I think, the worst case scenario. In a lot of ways, if, let's say he has amazing success, let's say they go 11-1, 10-2 the first 2 years, Ryan Day continues to not beat Michigan. They will back up the truck for him. And then we're in the same position 2 years later, and you've already alienated the guy who was kind of supposed to be the next guy.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you pay attention to the Ohio State program, they're questioning what's going on at head coach there, which is a wild thing to think of, with the amount of talent and, the success that they've had there. But that's the reality there. And that's the reality of the new college football landscape, right? I mean, it's we got to do this now, and we'll move mountains in order for that to happen. And, I guess if you're approaching it from that lens, you can't make decisions worried about what could happen in a year or two, right? I mean, I think everything is just the immediate. This is what we need right now. And that is the way that Chris McIntosh appears to have approached this season with, how quickly he moved on from Paul Chryst and how quickly he moved on from Jim Leonhard as well. I mean, it really did seem like Leonhard was going to be that guy. I mean, from the jump, right? I mean, it looked like it was Leonhard's job to lose. And then everything that you were hearing throughout the last handful of weeks is it's going to be Jim Leonhard. They talked to, a few guys, Dave Aranda being one of them, Lance Leopold being another one, but it looked
Matt
like
Rule is another one.
Matt Rule, another one. And what if they beat Iowa? Is Jim Leonhard already the head coach? And Matt, you and I talked about this just before jumping on. What was the plan here? Was this a day-by-day thing? Was this I don't know. It seems very much like every day we're going to wake up and see what happens, and it could be different today, and the guy could be different the next day. It's crazy to kind of look at.
It feels like they're flying by the seat of their pants, like completely flying by the seat of their pants. And to me, that is wild. It's the most un-Wisconsin like thing to do. This has always been a very conservative, not politically, but a conservative program in the way that it makes moves. It gives coaches a long tail, typically. I mean, we saw just how bad the hockey program had to get before they made moves. We've seen now, for better in a lot of ways, Greg Gard has been able to, weather some of the times where his job was being called for, and, he's had success moving past that. I don't know if the lulls that Gard was having a couple of years ago, he would last today in those same kind of things without the success that they had even last season. So it's pretty crazy to think just how fast things are changing. But this is the world we live in, and on top of that, it's money. I think at the end of the day, it just all comes down to money. And so if I'm Luke Fickell, I need guarantees from this administration that you are actually going to pony up and for a recruiting department and a recruiting budget, and show me that you can actually compete, because Wisconsin's recruiting budget's less than Cincinnati's. So if you're Luke Fickell, why are you losing the lifeblood of your program? Why would you leave that place to have a place that doesn't even recruit as strong? So that would be a big thing for me as Fickell, and I'm very curious to see what sort of guarantees and how the program is restructured in that way.
Right, and that's something that we've talked about too. Is Fickell doesn't even get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation if those things aren't assured to him. Like, the recruiting department will have this amount of allotted money. Facilities, we are going to be doing with this facilities and moving forward with this. Pay for my coaching staff, we're going to be able to do this. NIL money, this is what we're envisioning happening here. This is the resources that we have here. All those things are things that needed to be, I'm guessing, right? I obviously don't know for sure, established before Luke Fickell even thinks about, making this jump, because, obviously he's got things going at Cincinnati. And like you talked about, when that Ohio State job opens up, and I don't think they should fire Ryan Day. Look, I don't. But look, you got a good thing going in Ohio. But again, if you look at, like we've talked about, college football landscape, maybe these head coaches in college football are saying, I need to get to the Big Ten, or I need to go to the SEC, because if I'm not in one of those two conferences, then I am on the outside looking in for the future of college football.
Yeah, and I mean, even Cincinnati is going to be a Big 12 school in like 2 years, I think, from now. But we're even seeing, you mentioned that, like, that's not even going to matter. It's going to be a 2-conference league, basically, right? It's going to be SEC and Big 10. And so to get a seat at the big boy table, you have to be in one of those 2 conferences. And it's just, I'm still a little bit blown. I'm very curious, though, to hear from, because there's a lot of alumni currently coaching in the program. There's a lot, like Wisconsin has a much larger percentage of Badger alumni on the coaching staff than I think any other school in the country. What happens there? I mean, we can expect a complete dismantling, I would imagine, of the current coaching staff from pretty much head to toe. I don't know how many defensive guys are going to stick around not under Leonhard. So this is going to be interesting. I think everyone saw that the offense needed a huge revamping, no matter who the next head coach was. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the coaching staff on the defensive side of the ball and in the recruiting department, where they already have a lot of former Badgers there.
Yeah, and just in the entire staff, right? I mean, there's people littered in the strength and conditioning program and the, staff members, the graduate assistants and the analysts, and there's Wisconsin through and through. And like you and I have talked about, Matt, loyalty and the frame of doing that was maybe one of Paul Chryst's biggest flaws. So having gone through these coaching changes, I remember the first one, and you're like, okay, who is Gary Anderson going to keep? Or, usually it's a complete start over, right? Like, so if you're looking at assistant coaches that, maybe will be kept, I think it's more appropriate to look at Luke Fickell's staff and see, like, okay, who's he going to bring over from his staff? You would imagine largely that he's intact. A couple of people have texted me and said, what if Luke Fickell could get Jim Leonhard to stay on his DC? That doesn't seem like a possibility with the way that this is. Ohio State
tried to do that exact thing with Luke Fickell, and we all know how that went, right? Remember, he was the interim coach. They put someone else above him, and he stayed on as DC and then bolted to Cincinnati 1 year later for good reason. And that's not happening. And if I'm Jim, I think that's a slap in the face.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's a scenario where that happens. I think the most likely thing, maybe not the most likely thing, maybe Gutekunst picks up the phone and says, Jim, can we make another run at you for our DC job up here in Green Bay? But I don't know. I think it's more appropriate to look at who could come over from Cincinnati as opposed to, who is going to stay from Wisconsin staff. I think that had Jim Leonhard stayed, you felt good about a lot of the defensive guys. Bobby April's a guy who's recruited well. Maybe he would have been the next defensive coordinator there. I think Ross Kalaji's done a good job in terms of player development at that position. D'Onofrio in his short time, I think the inside linebackers have made a jump, and they didn't start from a great place.
They didn't, but they did not show well against Minnesota yesterday. I thought the inside linebackers had a rough game, as well as the safeties. And to me, honestly, a little bit. Like we said, they might be flying by the seat of their pants. So now it's time to go into reckless speculation mode, or maybe not complete reckless speculation mode. Watching the secondary get torn up by a redshirt freshman quarterback. He threw for 319 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks against the secondary looked terrible. And that's Jim Leonhard's baby. And I think that might have been one of the tipping points. If they beat Minnesota, is Jim Leonhard the head coach today? And again, I kind of think so. I kind of think if they win that game, Jim Leonhard's the head coach. And so this is again, I can't imagine Chris McIntosh making that move after a win. I think after a loss gives him enough leverage and coverage. After also you see how many people yesterday were just like, oh my God, this team, this offense again.
And you're never going to get a straight answer, right? Of the timeline when Fickell became a legit option. I mean, was it last night? Was it 3 weeks ago? Was it, hey, you reached out 4 weeks ago, haven't heard back, but then things heated up in the last handful of hours? I mean, was Mac up at night at 3 a.m, hammering out some of these details? Who knows? But you mentioned fumbling through this process, and I said they may have fumbled into the end zone and landed on the football with Fickell. And I'm very Wisconsin, kind of wired when I'm, during the football season, much more so on the recruiting side of things. I watch a lot of college football, but not from the lens that some other people do. But just with the messages that I've been getting from like people in our rivals network to just college football fans in general, they seem to be ecstatic about this potential hire, which I think is going to go down in a couple hours here, of like a best case scenario home run-ish type of hire with Luke Fickell and what he brings to the table. So, you can kind of kick them throughout this process and critique what it looked like from the outside looking in. But at the end of the day, Wisconsin may have gone from Paul Chryst to Luke Fickell. And if you can kind of throw the last couple months of football out the window, Wisconsin, the future does look bright with this hire.
Yeah, I think it's a very different feel if Paul Chryst is fired today and Luke Fickell is then, if Paul Chryst plays out the season with this result, then giving the hope of Jim Leonhard. And I think that is going to be the big point of discussion and issue. That is the biggest thing going forward in terms of how fans and people around the program are going to feel about this. Now, obviously, winning is going to cure anything. This team goes out and goes 11-1, makes it the Big Ten title game next year. If they, are able to really turn it around fast, that's going to cure everything. But, like we said, nothing is guaranteed here. And I'm just, if there's one coach that I think Wisconsin fans hope that he brings over with him, it's got to be Kerry Coombs, the special teams coach. Maybe they can have a dedicated special teams coach.
Yeah. And to just kind of piggyback off that, the feedback that we have been getting from the current players it's not mixed, right? It was at the start very much shocked that Paul Chryst was let go. But in the last handful of weeks we want Paul Chryst to be, we want Jim Leonhard to be our next head coach. And walking into that locker room and looking at some of the leaders there, Keanu Benton's going to the NFL. Nick Herbig is likely going to the NFL. I'd be shocked if he came back, especially after this news. In trying to win that locker room over and assure them, a lot of the things that they're used to will still be in place, but this is the vision I have for this team. I'm curious if they're going to be able to fill the roster for the bowl game. Now, that's a little bit of hyperbole, but, it could be a mass exodus going into that portal, and a lot will maybe depend on that first conversation or that first impression that this locker room gets from Luke Fickell when he arrives on campus. I don't know. He might be in flight right now. So maybe that conversation takes place Sunday evening with the team, because that is a pro Jim Leonhard locker room right now. And I think a lot of guys are let down and disappointed if they've even found out yet, right? I mean, the news might still be trickling into that locker room.
I just saw a tweet from Herbig right before we hopped on that just said LMFAO. So I think they have at least found something out, would be my guess. But it's kind of wild. If we know one thing, it'll be easy for Kenny Ditcher to get Fickell to Madison real easy. He's got jets waiting for it. So it's still wild. There will be much more to come on Badger Blitz, obviously all week. As the news comes in, Clint and I will be back to talk about what the heck this means for recruiting. Stay tuned. We'll have a lot of opinions, a lot of thoughts, and John, this is a wild time to be around the Wisconsin program. Nothing like I can remember in 25 years of following them.
Well, even just the athletic department in general, right? I mean, this has to be the biggest hire. I don't think this is a flashy hire, right? I mean, this isn't like, someone with a lot of pop
Deion
and
Sanders
with them, but like this is, when the dust settles on this, I'm sure the national reaction to this will be overly positive, right? Like Wisconsin knocked it out of the park here. So, in terms of that, and just in terms of like we talked about, the steps that they had to take in order to get here, it's crazy. I mean, I think this is bigger than, Bielema leaving, at the timing that he did. I think with everything that's went into these last couple of weeks, I think this story and everything that's went into it kind of trumps what has ever happened really with this program, which has been like an uneventful program, right? And that's a good thing,
Yes, it's been one of the most mundane, in a good way, programs since Barry Alvarez took over.
Yeah,
it's just been as steady as it goes. You mentioned not having enough guys to field a team for the bowl game. I was talking with a friend of mine, actually, who's not an ardent Iowa. Well, he's an ardent Iowa supporter, but that's kind of beside the fact. That one of the best.
It's not Matt Bernstein,
then. No, it's not Matt Bernstein. But one of the things he was saying is that in a lot of ways, one of the best things for Wisconsin could be to break that bowl streak, to really show that you need a clean start from the beginning. And I don't disagree with him. It may not be the worst thing in the world if this team, well, you're going to want to get the reps under the new coach. It's going to be really weird for a bowl team, though, because I wouldn't be surprised if you see Miles Burkett start in the bowl game.
Well, I said that they should start Burkett even if Jim Leonhard was the coach, right?
Oh yeah,
I would have put Burkett out there as my bowl game starter, regardless of who is the coach, because regardless of who is leading this program, that quarterback position is something that needs to be addressed and handled through the portal in a number of different ways. That might be a conversation for a different day, but yeah, I would have put Burkett there if it's Jim Leonhard or if it's Luke Fickell or anyone in between. I think, why wouldn't you see what you have there and you can still preserve his red shirt?
Yeah, I think it's a win-win situation there. So, and it was just killing me last night, speaking of the portal quarterback, just to watch Caleb Williams absolutely carve up Notre Dame and just do things that when his offensive line failed him, he was able to get out of it, things that Graham Mertz just simply can't do. And it's just another tease. And maybe under a new coaching regime, they have a different approach to the portal. Who knows? It's going to be crazy. You guys are going to need to stay tuned in to BadgerBlitz.com for all the breaking news and analysis from the team led by Jon McNamara. So make sure that you are keeping up with BadgerBlitz.com on Twitter and keeping up with Jon on Twitter at McNamara Rivals. And until next time, we'll see you guys in the den.